You are listening to the War on the Rocks podcast on strategy, defense, and foreign affairs. My name is Ryan Evans, the founder of War on the Rocks, and in this episode I was joined by two friends, Dave McCormick, the author of Superpower and Peril, A Battle Plan to Renew America, and Chris Brose, part of the leadership team of Anduril. He also wrote a really good book a couple of years back called The Kill Chain that many listeners of this podcast might have read and should have read. Both books are terrific. Both guests are old friends, and it was really great to have them on the show.
I started writing the book several years ago after I had written the Texas National Security Review article that you and I spoke so much about, and that you gave me good feedback on. And then I thought, after writing a couple articles, that I'd write a collection of essays. And we thought about that a bit. James Cunningham and I, who's my great collaborator and friend, and we decided, no, let's write a book. And so we wrote a proposal for a book, I think in 2020, and then decided to run for the Senate in late 21. And so we had to put the book on hold for a bit. So we had about 70% of it done before we ran. And then after the campaign, there was an opportunity to integrate all the stories from Pennsylvania. And the thrust of the book in a nutshell is America's in decline. And decline is a choice, and so is renewal. And this is a book about a plan for renewal. This is the what to do book.
Chris, you've talked about these same issues a lot. We've thought about it, talked about it for years. What's still missing when it comes to using innovation to power American renewal in terms of policies, where Congress should be, where the executive branch should be?
Yeah, and I think I'm still making my way through the book, but really, congratulate Dave and James on writing it. I think it's like an absolutely critical argument at a critical time, because I think a lot of what's missing is just, to sum it up in a word, is seriousness. I think when you look at the United States, much of it is going in the right direction in terms of the technology and sort of the innovation community that you need. We have plenty of money to include in defense, where everyone says we don't have enough money. We're spending $850 billion this year. It can buy a pretty good military. And we have phenomenal people, right? I mean, critical thinking, educated, risk-taking people in government and out of government. I think the thing that is still lacking is a degree of seriousness to get after this problem at the speed and the scale and with the urgency that it requires. And I think that's a lot of the underlying message of the book and the article before it. We can absolutely do this, right? I mean, if we were missing any of those aspects or elements, this wouldn't be possible. But because we have them, it's entirely possible if we kind of change our mind and say, look, from the standpoint of how the government involves itself in this conversation, if we are serious, we can kind of align the right incentives, marshal the resources, and move quickly to address what are fundamentally kind of innovation problems that exist across our society, where you have a lack of disruption, a lack of kind of real technological change. In many cases, because of market failures or government involving itself in the wrong ways, and government involving itself in the right ways can be a way to sort of kickstart a lot of this. And I think you've seen a beginning of this with the CHIPS Act, where you're now starting to see a strategic change to bring critical technologies back into the United States. And there's a series of other areas where we need to get a lot more serious about doing something similar.
Dave, and then you, Chris, because Chris, you tackled this in your book, The Kill Chain. You call this out as a real urgent set of issues. What explains the urgency?
Well, I was thinking about this very holistically at the national level, the national power level, in the sense that the argument we make is that America's in decline. Economic decline, decline in relative capability from a national security perspective, decline spiritually, in the sense that our institutions are eroding. They're being hijacked by an ideology that's sort of undermining some basic premises of America's success. And so we're at an inflection point. And that's not unprecedented in American history. We've gotten to the edge and pulled ourselves back before, but we need to have a real course correction from a renewal perspective. We need good policies and good leadership to take us back on the path to being a superpower. The title of the book is Superpower and Peril, and that truly is a risk. And the argument we're making is essentially that there's, you learn this as a CEO, there's so many things to fix in any country or any company. You have to zero in on the things that are going to be most powerful to change the course. And so we focus in on talent, technology, and data as the long pole in the tent, essentially the drivers of innovation, but also the drivers of economic success, the drivers of turning around the stagnation, the loss of productivity that we've seen. And they become the basis for not only national security capability, the things that Chris has written so much about and so effectively about, but also economic success. So our argument is that we need to do two things to be successful in renewal. One is we need to go to the gym at home. We need to do the muscle building, but we also need to confront China abroad. And the combination of those things together is at the core of America's renewal.
Yeah, and I think the muscle building is, as I would see it, focused on building new muscles, right? Not sort of trying to regain or build back old muscles. So as an example, just kind of in the defense world, right? 30, 40 years of deindustrialization has led us to a situation where when you look at shipbuilding as an industry, 45% of global shipbuilding is in China, and America has less than 0.1%. So you kind of pan back and ask the question, well, then how in the world are we going to compete in a traditional shipbuilding race? I would contend that we're just not. So it's not about trying to do something that we once did. It's about trying to do something completely different and compete in a different way, centered around technology and innovation, as Dave is pointing out. There's a smart and a better way to do this, but the idea that we're somehow going to go back to a traditional approach to this problem, I think, is a fool's errand.
I want to turn to the issue of talent. We've all run organizations, and I believe fundamentally that every problem is a people problem. And once you get to that, I have a follow-up.
Well, it starts with the fact that we're failing from an educational perspective, and you got to start every plan for the future with a diagnosis of where things have gone astray in our secondary school system. I think we all knew this, but COVID brought it into focus how much our school system is failing us. It brought it because parents got to see up close and personal. So statistically, we're 22nd in the world among developed countries in terms of the quality of the education of our kids. 25 to 30% of our kids who graduate from high school could actually operate at college level math or English. We saw up close the fact that American history is being taught in a way that is really questioning America's role in the world, America's exceptionalism. And that's important because if you don't believe America's got something special in terms of why it was conceived and how it exists in the world and what it's done for humanity, then you don't wake up every morning thinking about how you preserve the exceptional nature of it. So we've got a real problem there. And at its core is a monopoly that exists within the public school system and the teachers' unions that disadvantages kids, but mostly disadvantages minority kids and blue-collar kids. And this is the moment that we need to move forward on structural changes around school choice. And I think that this might be the inflection point because you see it with governors pushing this in Florida and Arkansas and other places. The second piece on talent that we talk about is skilled workers. So we have when I grew up in my hometown, the path to the American dream in rural Pennsylvania was you had to go to college. And lots of parents who thought that hadn't gone to college, 70% of them or something in my area, they thought that was the path for their kids. Well, that's not the path for every kid. And there's huge opportunities for skilled labor. And I saw this on the campaign trail when I was running for the Senate, where advanced manufacturing, fracking, all these places have a real dearth of skilled workers. So there's opportunity if we put the resources in the direction of our public policy on incenting that, Pell Grants, veterans benefits, and so forth, to encourage skilled workers. And then the third is immigration reform. I saw up close and personal, I went to the border and saw the tragedy of open borders and what that means for human trafficking and national security with the cartels and so forth. That has to be addressed. But the other side of this is skilled immigration. And there's a need for reform on skilled immigration that really zeroes in on the kinds of skills and capabilities that we need. Many advanced countries do it this way, that we need to not displace American workers, but supplement the gaps in our economy. Those three things together are a talent agenda that's necessary to compete and win in the world that we live in today, where technology is moving at such a fast pace that the leaders in technology will not only be the most powerful economies, the most vibrant, productive economies in the world, they'll also be the most significant capabilities from a national security perspective.
Yeah, if I can just add a kind of an example to that, I mean, agree with everything Dave is saying. And I think a personal example in terms of where I spend most of my time now at Anduril Industries, defense technology company. A lot of what we're focused on now is sort of scaling large-scale development and deployment of kind of autonomous systems. Well, those systems have to be built someplace. Some of that on a software side is going to be, kind of higher-end software development, but a lot of the production of the underlying platforms, the sensors, the integration of those things, those are absolutely high-skilled jobs that you're going to need to create in large numbers. So as we kind of look around at programs that we're scaling to produce these things in quantities, not surprisingly, right? It's like, where would you want to put down new production facilities? And it's places like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Alabama, Mississippi, Kentucky. These are all places that we're literally actively considering, growing the expansion of production facilities in the company to support programs that we're winning for very kind of high technology defense capabilities. So a microcosm of, I think, what Dave is talking about, but this is very real. It is job creating, and it's job creating in exactly the kinds of sectors of American society where we desperately need it.
But is that talent there that you need, that high-tech, deep-tech talent?
Yeah, I think it's mixed, right? So some of it is very high-tech talent where, high-end coding and, kind of applications of artificial intelligence are going to be a different skill set that you might sort of prioritize its location in a different area. For the production of, large autonomous underwater vehicles, advanced manufacturing of systems, integration of, full-up capabilities, or the production of subcomponents, those are very kind of high-skilled jobs, but they're not necessarily the kinds of jobs that you need 4 years of college education for. I mean, you can skill those people to do those jobs, and there's actually a significant amount of workforce that you can draw upon, in the workforce or looking for work to fill those kinds of positions. And then, obviously, there are things that we need to do to help sort of further up-level, educate, and skill those people to perform the tasks that we're looking to perform.
You brought up the CHIPS Act earlier, and for listeners, this was animated by the idea that we don't produce enough high-quality microprocessors in the United States, and we needed to stimulate that industry, especially because so many chips come from Taiwan, which is under threat from China. And it's great that CHIPS Act passed, and there's going to be new foundries, but we don't have the people for them. And this goes back to your point about highly skilled immigration and the importance of bringing in people from places like India, for example, and other parts of the world. But it seems like that other part of the policy hasn't gotten there yet, because innovation and immigration, rather, not innovation, is this fraught issue.
Yeah, I think that's right. But it's also because of a lack of emphasis on creating opportunity for Americans. And that's both the substantive challenge and the political challenge, in the sense that we need to invest in helping people make that transition with education, so those skilled labor opportunities are available for allowing the thing that's slipping away. And this is the reason immigration is so prominent. The thing that's slipping away is the American dream. The American dream, in a sentence, was that if you work hard and focus, you can have an opportunity to have a great middle-class life, participate in the American economy, and that most parents can think that their kids are going to be better off than they are. That's the American dream in a nutshell. 67% of Americans think that that's not true anymore, that their kids are not going to be better off than they are. So the way to handle this skills gap, I believe, is that there's a huge emphasis on training the next generation of skilled workers in America, while also supplementing with skilled immigration in a way that serves America's needs. This is a case where it should be in America's interest in terms of where we bring those skilled immigrants into the workforce. And that combination, I think, will be good for our economy, good for innovation, and good for the American worker.
A lot of the ideas in your book have been percolating for years. You've written about them before, for example, but others have. Chris, in the kill chain before this administration has started, I actually was just in a little coffee shop, and two guys next to me were talking about, this guy named Chris Brose wrote this great book, but really fucked up title, The Kill Chain. But anyway, these ideas that you put out there, Dave, first in the TNS article and now in your book, what do you still think needs to get taken up at a sort of industrial policy or DoD innovation level that's just not happening yet in this administration?
Well, I have a thought on that, because I try to make this very explicit in the book, and it's an area that should be debated because there's a lot of controversy around it. I think that what needs to happen in technology, you need to start with the premise, which I think Chris agrees with, but I'm not sure, is that we're falling behind in technology. So we should talk about that, whether that's true or not. And the reason I say that is there's been a number of pieces of research that suggest that to be true. Everything from the USTR Lighthizer report in 2017 looked at the 20 key technologies and assessed where we were, to just this Australian think tank a couple of weeks ago that was in the Wall Street Journal that suggested we were behind in 37 of 44 critical technologies. And these technologies are at the intersection of economic well-being and dynamism and national security. And that's one of the things that's changed is, I ran the part of the Commerce Department that focused on dual-use technologies. Well, the most important technologies are all dual-use today. And I would argue that a lot of them are zero-sum in the sense that if you get a leadership position like in 5G, it's very hard to have a capability that's going to be offsetting of that. So if you start with the premise that we're behind, then you need a national effort to close that gap, or at least maintain the leadership that's necessary for American interest. And I don't think we can adopt a Chinese model, to do that, where you have state allocation of capital. There's a lot of reasons that will ultimately probably fail, but there's also a lot of reasons that won't work in America. I'm also not arguing in my book, Superpower and Peril, that we should adopt an industrial policy. While I thought the CHIPS Act was well directed, it smells of some industrial policy kinds of things. And industrial policy means that the government is intervening in the allocation of capital in a way that ultimately creates second and third order consequences that are potentially corrupting of the whole overall purpose. So we need to find a way to focus on the technologies that are important, but also drive market forces. So to back to the CHIPS Act, great idea in the sense that we have a huge gap, but not enough in terms of the level of investment that will be required. And then most recently, what you saw was the Commerce Department putting on top of the commitment that's made to the individual companies a whole set of other measures around daycare and environmental standards and everything, which smells of the government getting very involved in engineering how capital is going to be deployed and who gets it, and everything, which I think is ultimately a slippery slope and the beginning of the end in terms of achieving the public policy goals. So what I'm arguing for in the book is a way to have the government play a role with tax incentives or innovation funds that direct private capital, incent private capital to go to the areas where we have the biggest needs, but do so in a way that doesn't have the government picking winners and losers, and has the government essentially creating incentives by maybe taking first loss, capping its return, but driving capital in a way where all the benefits of the private sector are brought to bear. And we've got a real problem now, and the current path is not solving that problem.
Yeah, and I think to build on that, the incentives piece is the core thing that I focused on in my book. And I was only looking at defense, and defense is a different situation or a different example because it is a monopsony. Like the government is the buyer of defense. There is no other buyer. I think what getting the incentives right means in that case is the government has to be a better buyer of capability. So where I see this still going wrong is there's tons of innovation happening. There's innovation happening technologically, operationally, organizationally, but it's all very low level, very disaggregated, and rarely does it get sort of brought up to real scale to make a disruptive impact on how we sort of organize and operate the military. So I would totally agree with Dave's contention. I do think we are falling behind. Again, I think defense is a little bit different, but the story is still bad. We are not on the right trajectory. And if we stay on that trajectory, it's not going to end well for us. But I think where the government in this case needs to play a better role is not investing in companies, not trying to do what private companies can do or what private investors can do. It's actually aligning the incentives as a buyer of capability to lift really game-changing innovations, new types of systems that are available now up to real scale. And when you do that, you are actually getting systems into the hands of warfighters who need them. You are generating deterrence now. You are pushing that sort of window of vulnerability farther to the right rather than having it continue to creep farther to the left, as we've seen. But I think what you also get are these second and third order consequences, good consequences, where companies that want to do this work are being rewarded. They're able to create jobs, both highly skilled and lower skilled. You're able to then marshal kind of private capital that is out there, in the billions of dollars. A lot harder environment in which to raise now than, years past. But that money is still out there looking for good things to do. And again, I think if the government is creating the right kinds of incentives, that money is going to flow in, talent is going to flow in. We're going to solve this problem as Americans because we're capable of it. We want to do it. But in this instance, in defense, I think the government needs to create different and better incentives for it to change faster.
Dave, I've seen some of your media hits talking about the Silicon Valley Bank collapse, and I'll let you recap your own views on this, but you basically said the government should not have bailed out the bank. But given that so much of the vision for American renewal hinges on innovation, and Silicon Valley is so central to that, a lot of the companies that had to make payroll that would have gone out of business if the government didn't bail them out, these would have been the losers in that situation, some of America's most innovative companies. So how do you square those two ideas with your critique of the bailout and these innovative companies playing an important role in our economy?
Well, the big thing that I'm trying to capture in my book, and it's a political matter, but I think it's really critical to the future of the country, is traditional conservative thinking, traditional conservative principles have failed in many ways to meet the needs of a huge part of our population. And I see this across Pennsylvania, I see it across the country, where the last 20 years have been very bad for many people who, if you had assets, you got a lot richer. If you didn't have assets for the last 20 years, real income has stayed flat. And the fentanyl crisis has, hurt these communities desperately. The inflation hurts people that are living month to month. And so we've got a real economic, political challenge. And that's why 80% of Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. And that also explains the rise of President Trump, where he tapped into that anger and frustration. And so what the book is trying to put forward is a set of policies that capture both traditional conservative thinking around small government and market-driven outcomes and the exceptionalism of America and the role it plays in the world, with the recognition that we need to have policies that actually deal with the fact that a huge part of our population has been left behind. So that's the starting premise. And the argument that elites in Washington and New York and the Silicon Valley have lost touch with what's happening across America is very real. And I've played in both worlds. I see it, and I think there's merit in that frustration. And so that's what the agenda of Superpower and Peril is trying to do. But to go back to Silicon Valley Bank, there's 2 points I make. The first point is this Silicon Valley Bank is not an isolated thing. It's the consequence of really bad policy. Enormous spending that's taken place over the last 2 years under the Biden administration. There's been spending before that, but the increase in spending, 40% in discretionary, the 3 big pieces of legislation that have added over $10 trillion, that is a huge driver of inflation. That combined with low interest rates that have persisted for more than a decade is the reason the Fed had to rapidly raise interest rates. And that's what's created the hole on the banks of the Silicon Valley and the banking system more broadly. In the case of the Silicon Valley Bank, the reason that I objected to what was done was, first, it was terribly managed, and the regulators in the San Francisco Fed missed the boat. So you've got this huge problem. Now there's a background. Everybody's got a problem. This problem's much worse because of incompetence. And then secondarily, what happened when they insured the uninsured depositors, you referred to it as the bailout of the uninsured depositors, what they did is they hit all the equity owners and the credit owners. So what that means in effect is if you're the guy that has the lawn mowing contract with Silicon Valley Bank and Silicon Valley Bank owed you $10,000, that got wiped out. But the venture capitalist that lives down the road and had $1 million of deposits, uninsured, was protected. And so that seems consistent with, wait a second, like what are we doing here in terms of making sure we understand who's getting hurt and who's not? Secondarily, what's happened is, in effect, $8 trillion of uninsured deposits have an expectation that they're insured. So you've got second and third order consequences associated with that. And I'm not sure what they are. The one thing I learned in 2008 when I was in the financial crisis, and through that, I'm not in the predicting business, because if you go into predicting business of markets, you put yourself at a disadvantage. But certainly that's going to have implications for the regional banks. Certainly that has implications for the fees and the cost, because if you had an insurance policy that covered $8 trillion that wasn't insured yesterday, well, who's going to pay for that insurance? It's real insurance, right? So I don't think this has been adequately thought through, and I think it smells of a quick reaction to cover off on the people that could make phone calls to Washington without an adequate thinking of what it means across our society. Now, this isn't easy to do when you're in crisis, so I'm not trying to throw beer cans from the stands, but that struck me as taking us in the wrong direction too quickly without adequate thought.
I guess one thing that's different now, and Chris, I'd be curious to get your response to this. It's amazing how much innovative technology investments are going on in other parts of the country, like Kentucky, Alabama, Georgia, Pennsylvania, Texas, although that's been around for a longer period of time. And that seems to be a positive trend, so that it's not all being concentrated in this one particular place in the western part of the country, which can be a little politically limiting and also limiting in terms of viewpoint. But what are you coming across?
Yeah, we come across them all the time. We partner with them. They're part of our supply chains. We may or may not be doing future acquisitions of some of them. And I think it's, for a lot of the sort of high-tech industry, a lot of it's been focused on commercial software, and that's very concentrated in certain areas, certain skill sets. But when you kind of look deeper, at least in the world that I live in defense, a lot of this is hardware centric. It's grinding germanium domes and building rocket motors and sensors and other things that you're probably not doing in very expensive office space in Palo Alto. So those innovations are out there, and I think that you've begun to see also a recognition by the venture capital community that they need to cast a wider net. I think COVID sort of helped the geographic disbursement of venture capital, but I think they are now actively looking for companies that are doing this kind of work, at least inside the defense space, where they have an incredibly important contribution to make to national security. And helping these companies get to scale, produce more of what they're producing, contribute more to have a more vibrant and healthier industrial base is absolutely essential. I think the war in Ukraine has kind of put a fine point on that, where we've seen that things that we've largely known, right, for years, that we're single-threaded. We have single points of failure across critical parts of our supply chains and our industrial base and many of our kind of larger systems. We've got to make that healthy, and we're going to make that healthy through investments, not just in the critical suppliers who are providing them now, but in new suppliers to create redundancy, competition, innovation, and begin to sort of fill in some of these holes and get beyond the traditional ways we've done this.
Is Anduril involved at all with helping Ukrainian forces? I don't know if you can talk about it if you are.
Yeah, we are. We've talked about it publicly. We have systems deployed in Ukraine now. We have systems as part of the recent security assistance package that the Biden administration announced that were called out in public. So, we're proud to do this work. We look at this as a critical opportunity and responsibility to help the Ukrainians in their defense of their country. And I think selfishly, it is a proving ground to actually prove out the kinds of technologies that we're developing and test them in the real most contested, sort of most challenging kinds of environments that they're going to have to face. And I think what we've seen in our work there is there are some companies who are kind of rising to that challenge and adapting and changing quickly, and their systems are being used and being demanded, and others that are not. But it's not sort of a case of it's all old, it's all new. And I think this is what makes Ukraine so interesting. War on the Rocks has run terrific articles about why the tank is still relevant, and sort of the more traditional systems that are still very relevant on the battlefield. But those very traditional systems, artillery systems and the like, are also being targeted by, Starlink commercial proliferated satellites, and AI-enabled targeting systems. So it's this, fascinating kind of merger of old and new, high technology, low technology, where the real innovation is not just in the capabilities, but it's how they're actually being put together and utilized, and responded to by the operators who are using them. Where advantages are fleeting and you're constantly struggling to sort of get one step ahead of your opponent, who's also innovating and changing just as quickly.
Yeah, as both of you know, I was in Ukraine in October, and one of the many memories that stick out in my head is we're driving along the road in rural Kherson, and we see right next to each other an artillery system that's probably older than me, and right next to it a Starlink satellite terminal that was being used for targeting, probably connected to a drone that was doing some ISR, and it was a pretty evocative image. Dave, as far as what Chris and I were just talking about with these companies in geographically diverse parts of the country, I want to give you a chance to respond to that, but I also want to ask you about the debate in the Republican Party about what the United States should and shouldn't be doing to help Ukraine.
Well, I want to, first of all, agree with what Chris was saying. I'll answer that Ukraine question in a second, but I think the proliferation of next generation technology, the rise of the rest in these places, and I talk about that a lot in the book as someone who went back to Pittsburgh and ran a software company there. There's an enormous opportunity for highly skilled workers with the right education agenda, for capital, for basic R&D at major universities like Carnegie Mellon. That's the future, and part of the strategic decoupling when we talk about China is bringing those certain industries, those that are of greatest significance to national security, home. And home doesn't mean necessarily the Silicon Valley or the greater Washington area. It means the heartland has a lot of opportunity and lots of workers, and this is all part of sort of bringing back the dynamism of our economy across all the economy. Yeah, on Ukraine, I think what we're having here is a debate that's a really important debate about what American interests are and how to fulfill them. And so where I come down on this is that it's very important that the United States continue to support Ukraine in their pursuit of overturning the aggression from Putin. But we need to do that because it's in our interest to do it. And the idea of Putin being successful and then continuing to be possibly aggressive and expansive in Europe would be hugely chaotic and hugely counter to America's interest in the world. And for those who say that we should focus our efforts on China instead of Russia, it seems to me that they're connected in very important ways, and that for us to not show leadership in Europe would only empower and encourage more aggression on the part of the Chinese. With all that said, I think we have to acknowledge that people have real concerns. They have concerns about the fact that we spent 20 years in war, and we need to make sure that our objectives remain limited and that we don't go down a path which draws American troops into Ukraine. And we also have to make sure that the treasure that we're investing is carefully managed with lots of accountability. And all you had to do was watch the terrible end of our conflict in Afghanistan and the military equipment on the airfield in Bagram to know that there's a real risk that won't happen. So I understand the sentiment and the concern, but I think we can't let that stand in the way of being strong in supporting U.S. interests by supporting the Ukrainians.
And if I could just add to that, there's an interesting argument about how to think about Ukraine in the context of, focusing on the Asia Pacific and the pacing threat of China. I would contend that actually the opportunity that we have in Ukraine, not just to kind of knock Russia back, but to actually surface a lot of the problems that we have within our own military, within our own industrial base, as well as the opportunity we have to prove out new capabilities, with the Ukrainians as partners to identify, what is actually working, what is actually benefiting them in this kind of highly contested fight that they have. These are lessons that we were going to have to learn eventually. I would much rather that we learn them in support of the Ukrainians who are fighting and sort of carrying that fight forward themselves than, God forbid, learning it in the first week or two, of a conflict with China. So we have an opportunity now, I think, because of Ukraine, to fix some things in our own system with our own supply chains, our own industrial base, with the number of systems that we are buying. And, I think as a result of that, we are going to be in an even stronger position to deter China than we would have been if Ukraine had not happened.
Chris, you've been in industry now for 4 years, after working in policy for much longer than that. You're in the C-suite of a major defense technology company. What in this experience have you learned that has surprised you, even though you were deeply steeped in defense before?
I think one answer to that question would be the lack of basic understanding of the sort of core tenets of capitalism that exists in our government. I find so often, I find myself in conversations that I can kind of like bin into the category of like explaining capitalism to the government. And, it's frustrating because, as we talked about earlier, all of the sort of core sort of building blocks that we need exist, right? Many of these defense challenges that we're talking about are not technology challenges. The technology is there. We're not talking about photon torpedoes and cloaking devices. The talent to develop it exists in this country. The money definitely does, both in government and out of it. It really comes back to sort of explaining how to set the incentives right to actually get the best out of this society, the private sector, or a different kind of industry, than the government is accustomed to. And I think a lot of the challenge that I see, I maybe I could say that I saw this and sort of believed this when I was in government, but I definitely see it now, is inside of national defense, I think we tend to look like China at its worst more than America at its best. And a lot of defense has just kind of grown up that way, where you're never going to have free market principles governing, the acquisition of, long-range bombers and, ICBMs and sort of aircraft carriers, right? The government's challenge is kind of managing performance in the absence of real competition, because you're just never going to have but so many companies who can do that. I think what you've really seen in recent years is this whole other sector of national defense that looks like weapons and low-cost satellites and autonomous systems, where you really can have something more like market creation. If the government actually created the right incentives, largely based around the amount of money that it was using to buy these systems at scale, you could begin creating real incentives for new companies to enter, to be successful based on their merits, where you weren't trying to manage change as a centrally directed, sort of Soviet-like process. You're actually able to do it more the way markets work, where you actually have real performance in the real world. You're pushing the research and development cost for new systems more onto the shoulders of industry rather than doing it centrally directed out of the government based on requirements that were written 10 years ago. So there's this terrific opportunity, I think, to kind of segment out what we mean by defense and say there's going to be a certain segment of it that's going to be rather traditional, very exquisite. It's going to be governed by, some better version of McNamara's, PPBE process. But there's this other sector, which is frankly the place that's going to make all the difference in the coming years because of actually things that we could get access to quickly if we bought them at real scale, where the principles of, kind of the right kind of incentives and market creation, real competition could actually govern this portion of the defense base.
And Dave, you've made a transition of your own from finance to politics. You ran for Senate for the Republican nomination in Pennsylvania, and I know you haven't made a decision yet about what you're going to be doing in the next cycle. But what surprised you about that transition?
I think the biggest surprise was how angry so many people feel across the country and certainly in Pennsylvania, where they feel like the system hasn't worked. And then when you sort of get into the middle of it, the fact that most Americans think the country's headed in the wrong direction. I mean, it really sinks in, and the fact that decline is real. I mean, we are declining by objective terms, and so the book has a very stark title. Superpower and Peril. It's very it's a pessimistic title in some ways.
Someone give you a more optimistic title.
Yeah, somebody gave you a more optimistic version, but the book's an optimistic book, And so people say, how do you square the pessimism in the title and the optimism in the book? And the answer is because this is the American tradition. It's the American story where we get to the edge of the cliff, we pull ourselves back. We've done it over and over again. And I personally experienced it as a kid in the late 70s where we had, stagflation and 15% inflation. We had gas lines. We had odd days and even days. We had Desert One where we lost service members on the sands of Iran. And 80% of Americans in 1979 thought the country was heading in the wrong direction. In 1983, I was a cadet at West Point and walking down those beautiful walkways looking down on the Hudson River, and America was back. It was morning in America. Inflation was in check. The economy was growing. We were in the middle of the Reagan buildup, which ended the Cold War 6 years later. But most important, people believed we were headed in the wrong direction. There were good policies there. The policies of that day are probably different than the policies we need for this day. But the kind of leadership we need is the same, which is leadership that looks forward, that takes us in a direction that executes on that vision. And so that's why I'm hopeful that in this moment of duress, we'll find a path to renewal. And I hope and think we will.
One last question. You wrote this book with James Cunningham, a mutual friend of ours who may or may not be sitting in the room with us. What did you learn about co-authoring?
I was blessed by James Cunningham. I will say that, and I'll tell a little story about this. You can keep it if you want, Ryan. But when I was interviewing people to potentially come work with me at Bridgewater to help on projects like this, we hadn't decided to write a book yet. I interviewed James, and he was working at the Hoover Institution for George Shultz, working on George's last book before he died. And I got a letter in the mail, and it was a handwritten letter from George Shultz. And he said, "I understand you're talking to James Cunningham. I've worked with lots of young people in my almost 100 years of life, and this man's very special, and you should hire him in." So when you get that kind of endorsement from George Shultz, and he's been even better than I imagined. So he's a great friend and colleague.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the War on the Rocks podcast. Stay safe and stay healthy.